In this lesson, we'll learn how we can import 3D geometry from another application. So up to this point, as we've been working within RealFlow, we have been using pieces of geometry, but really it's just been some of these pre-built primitive objects. Now, within RealFlow, we actually have the ability to bring in 3D geometry from other applications, and we can actually bring in really any kind of geometry that we want, whether it be static mesh, an animated piece of geometry, whatever the case may be. So let's look at how we can actually start to bring some of these different objects in. Now, for this particular example, I'm going to be showing how to bring the geometry out of Maya, but really this is going to be a very, very similar process for any 3D application. So RealFlow really has the ability to bring in two different types of geometry, one being an OBJ file, the other is a special SD file, which is special and unique to RealFlow. So really, when it comes to importing an OBJ file, it's really just a simple matter of selecting your geometry, export the OBJ, and bring it back into RealFlow. Now, an SD file is a little bit different and a little bit more flexible. So with an SD file, we can actually import any animation that we may already have within our 3D application. We can actually start to take pieces of geometry or objects that maybe consist of multiple different pieces. So for example, I have this brick wall that's made up of several individual bricks. Well, if I were to take all of these different objects and export them as an OBJ file, it's going to bring it back into RealFlow as one single mesh, which I really don't want. So if I actually wanted this to be something that we could throw a boulder at and actually have it shatter and break apart within RealFlow, I would ideally want these to stay as separate bricks. Now, if I took all of these selected bricks and then exported this as an SD file instead, it'll still export just one file, but it'll actually bring it back into RealFlow as several individual pieces, which is really what I want in this case. The only stipulation that you have to remember whenever taking geometry into RealFlow is the fact that your geometry has to be triangulated. No quads or n-gons are allowed to go into RealFlow. So let's go ahead and I'll take my geometry here. I'll just select all my bricks. We can go to File, and let's just go to Export Selected. So we can go into my options here. And in my case, I'm going to set this to a RealFlow SD file. Now, this is a feature that only becomes available once you've installed the actual RealFlow plugin from NextLimit, and that can be found on the NextLimit website. So you'll download the plugin, install it for whichever 3D application you happen to be using, and then you should have the ability to start to import or export these RealFlow SD files. So we'll go ahead and choose that. We'll pull that down from the list. And in my case, just use my default playback range within my timeline. If we actually had animation that was maybe a character moving, maybe something that had joints or bones in it, something that was actually a deformed character, we could actually take that animation by turning on this export deformation. But in my case, I really don't have any animation on here that I need to take over, so that's really not a tremendous concern at this point for me. So we can go ahead and go to Export Selection. And in my case, I'm just going to put this in my Lesson 12 Start. And typically, the first place that RealFlow is going to look for any kind of a mesh or anything like that, a piece of geometry that you bring in from another application, it's going to look for it in this Objects folder. So just to make things easier, I'm going to go ahead and put it in there. And we can call this something like brick wall. Go ahead and save that out. And now we can bring this back into RealFlow. So back in this application, if we go back to our geometry pull down, if we go down to import, or just use the keyboard shortcut, which is Control-I, go ahead and click on that. Again, the first place it's going to look is inside the Objects folder for the project that you're currently working out of, in this case, Lesson 12 Start. Here's our brick wall that we just exported. Go ahead and open that up. And here's our geometry back in RealFlow. You can see it brings in the geometry as, again, every individual brick that we have set up, which is also what I want. We also have the camera that actually comes in from Maya, or our 3D application in this case. So being able to come in and we can very easily look through that. If we were to just right-click, we could actually scroll down, go to View, and instead of Perspective, just set this to Camera from SD1, which in our case is the camera position that came over from Maya. So now that we have this geometry that has been brought in, What we'll do in our next lesson is actually learn how we can start to create rigid body dynamics so we can actually start to throw things at this brick wall and actually watch this brick wall break and shatter apart. So we'll learn how we can start to do those sorts of effects in our next lesson.